Establishing central pawn control immediately opens lines and prepares for rapid piece development. Developing the knight to its most natural outpost creates immediate influence on the center and prepares for further development, subtly challenging white's central control. Asserting central control, this pawn advance immediately contests the d5 square and aims to build a robust pawn phalanx. Securing the center's foothold allows for bishop development and prepares a flexible pawn structure, avoiding premature commitments. Developing a knight to its natural square, this supports the central pawn and prepares for further development, aiming for active piece play. Pinning the knight immediately creates central tension and forces white to consider the consequences of their piece placement. Reinforcing the central pawn structure while keeping options open for kingside development is a flexible choice. Breaking the pawn chain immediately creates dynamic imbalance and opens avenues for counterplay. Preparing to fianchetto, white aims to control the long diagonal and secure their king. Opening the center's pawn structure simplifies the position and grants black immediate influence over key central squares. Reclaiming that pawn immediately resolves the tension and clears the path for further piece development, preparing to challenge control of the central squares. Prioritizing king's safety with this castling maneuver is a wise defensive step, aiming to tuck the monarch away behind a pawn shield and prepare for future central struggles. It's a pragmatic consolidation that also facilitates the development of the h8 rook, hinting at potential rook activity on the f-file or even a queen's side expansion. Developing the bishop to g2 solidifies control of the long diagonal, creating a formidable battery with the queen and preparing for potential kingside pressure later on. Challenging the center is precisely what's needed here, immediately creating dynamic imbalances and disrupting white's poised setup. This pawn thrust forces a decision, either accepting a central pawn exchange or allowing black to establish a stronger pawn presence, potentially opening lines for their pieces and aiming for active piece play. Unleashing the queen, white immediately injects pressure towards the queen side, challenging black's bishop and setting up potential tactics around the d5 pawn. This proactive queen sortie aims to disrupt black's comfortable development, forcing a response and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. It's a move that prioritizes initiative and seeks to exploit any lingering structural weaknesses in black's camp. Exchanging the bishop for the knight here fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating doubled pawns for white on the c-file, which could become a long-term weakness to exploit. But simultaneously, it offers white a free hand in the center and potentially opens lines for their pieces to attack. Opening the b-file for your rook adds immediate attacking potential, but creates a permanent pawn weakness on c3 that your opponent can exploit later. Re-establishing central presence, the knight boldly challenges white's queenside pawn structure and prepares to contest the now open d-file, potentially eyeing a swift development of the remaining pieces towards the center. Striking the center, this capture aims to destabilize black's pawn structure, potentially opening the c-file for white's rook and creating isolated pawns. Observe how this exchange alters the landscape, offering white initiative while forcing black into a period of pawn reconstruction. Consider the tactical consequences should black recapture carelessly. The knight makes a bold detour, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially exploit the weak c3 pawn while simultaneously preparing to occupy the advanced d4 square. A strategic repositioning, the queen vacates the d-file, aiming for a more active role on the c-file, potentially pressuring black's queenside pawns and supporting advances. Unleashing a knight to the center, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate this piece towards the kingside. This bold pawn grab from white 9. bxc3 has created a doubled pawn on the c-file, a potential weakness that black is now actively exploiting. The knight's central repositioning on d5 creates immediate pressure on white's d4 pawn and opens up lines for black's remaining pieces. Observe how the knight on a5, though seemingly out of play, indirectly supports this central thrust by forcing white's queen to a less active square. This move forces white to consider how to defend the compromised central pawn or develop a counterattack. The queen strategically repositions, eyeing the queen side and simultaneously reinforcing the d4 pawn while preparing for potential pawn advancements on the king side. The bishop now finds a more active post, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially participate in the central struggle. Initiating a pawn march on the queen side, c4 now challenges black's knight on a5 and aims to seize more central space by potentially expanding the pawn chain. A strategic repositioning begins, aiming to contest the central squares and prepare for potential activity on the king side, while simultaneously assessing the robustness of white's pawn structure after the capture on c3. The king's castle offers immediate safety, pulling the monarch away from the central fray where pawns are locked and minor pieces jockey for position. This development wisely prioritizes regal security before white fully commits to controlling the newly opened diagonal on the queen side, a crucial consideration given black's bishop now aiming towards that flank. Opening the c-file for the rook promises more active participation, aiming to pressure white's pawn structure. The knight repositions, seeking to escape the d-pawn's shadow and prepare a sortie towards the queen side, aiming to contest the outpost on c5 or potentially support a rook advance along the b-file. Seizing the initiative, black boldly snatches the pawn on c4, injecting immediate tactical complications into this already dynamic position and forcing white to confront a new set of immediate threats, potentially disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn structure and opening up lines of attack that were previously unavailable. Unleashing a bishop to attack the vulnerable b7 pawn, this move boldly seizes the initiative, disrupting black's pawn structure and opening up aggressive lines. A tactical concession for positional compensation, black prepares to defend against the immediate threat on the b-file, rerouting the rook to a more active diagonal, while simultaneously eyeing potential counterplay on the c-file. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal and a bit of breathing room from the immediate tactical storm, though it relinquishes some control over the d5 square. Initiating a daring pawn sacrifice here to lure the white queen out of its defensive posture, forcing it to choose between retreating and abandoning the bishop, or a potentially vulnerable position. Redirecting the queen to e3 seeks to connect the rooks on the open c-file and prepare a potential queenside expansion while keeping an eye on the central pawn structure. Recognizing the threat to the c4 pawn, black opts to dislodge the menacing bishop, initiating a cascade of positional adjustments. Seeking to exploit the exposed black king and generate a central initiative, the queen repositions to exert pressure on the queen side while maintaining support for the advancing pawns. Reclaiming the central pawn presence and initiating a fascinating positional dance, this maneuver prepares to challenge white's piece activity, particularly aiming to disrupt the queen's grip on the board and potentially freeing up black's own queenside. Bringing the queen back to d3, white aims to solidify their queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare a central pawn push like e4 later, while keeping a close eye on black's active knight on e5. Recognizing the opponent's knight is trapped on the queen side, the rook bravely ventures to the c-file, aiming to challenge the central pawn structure and potentially reroute its sibling to a more active square. The bishop's retreat to a3 creates a dynamic pressure point, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares around black's king, particularly if the c-file opens further and white can achieve a battery on the diagonal. Seeking respite for the endangered bishop, this maneuver repositions the piece to the more secure queen's flank, abandoning the d7 square to potentially bolster the queenside pawn structure and prepare for future central expansion or counterplay against white's advanced queenside pawns. Opening the file for your rooks presents an immediate tactical opportunity to exploit black's potentially exposed king, while simultaneously liberating your own rooks from defensive duties and preparing them for aggressive maneuvering. Black redirects their knight to its starting square, a surprisingly sensible decision given the chaos the piece has inadvertently caused, effectively conceding the c-file while aiming to untangle their pieces from their awkward defensive positions. Activating the rook on the d-file, this repositioning aims to leverage the open nature of the central files and put immediate pressure on black's queen's knight pawn. A bold decision to simplify into an endgame, discarding the queen with the intention of exploiting the suddenly open c-file and potentially creating a passed pawn with the pawn. The board is now stripped of its most powerful attacking pieces, shifting the focus to pawn structure and piece activity. Black's knight now has a clear path to become a more influential piece on the queen side, and White's king feels a little less secure with the absence of queenly protection. This exchange fundamentally alters the nature of the game, turning it into a strategic battle of maneuvering and pawn pushes rather than a sharp tactical fight. The subsequent play will hinge on Black's ability to coordinate their remaining pieces effectively and White's capacity to neutralize Black's queenside initiative. This exchange clears the board significantly, bringing the game closer to an endgame where pawn structure and active pieces will be paramount. By capturing the rook, White effectively centralizes their remaining heavy piece, preparing to contest the open c-file with doubled rooks if the opportunity arises. The immediate consequence is a simplified position, reducing the tactical complexity and demanding a keen eye for piece activity and pawn play from both sides. Black must now consider how to reposition their pieces to maximize their influence in the center and potentially on the open c-file, as White aims to exploit the potential weakness of Black's queenside pawns and activate their own rook on the central files. The queen's departure also means both players must be extra vigilant about king safety as open lines become more prevalent. The rook now anchors itself on the open file, a vigilant sentinel preparing to contest the crucial central roadway and potentially swarm the now exposed king in the event of pawn advances. The rook slides over, finally claiming the critical open file, a testament to the quiet coordination building up as the queens depart the board, now aiming to exert pressure on Black's potentially weak kingside structure. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure by fixing the f6 pawn is a sensible defensive maneuver, shoring up any potential weaknesses around Black's monarch, though it does slightly restrict the mobility of the e7 knight. Reasserting central control and aiming to dislodge the opponent's entrenched knight, this knight maneuver seeks to exploit the weakened squares around Black's king after the recent exchanges. Unleashing the rook to the b-file seeks to exploit the open nature of that highway, aiming to harass the queen and potentially disrupt White's king's safety or create threats on the queen side. Seizing control of the critical d4 square, White aims to disrupt Black's defensive setup and generate attacking chances. Finally, Black reroutes the rook to the kingside flank, seeking to disrupt White's seemingly anchored pieces and potentially create some activity on the last available open file. Pivoting the knight to the 5th rank immediately creates a thorny threat. If Black isn't careful, that knight can jump to c7, forking the rook and king and winning material. This maneuver also sets up a potential doubling of pawns on the b-file should Black move the rook, disrupting White's pawn structure but potentially gaining an open file for the queen or rook. A calculated dive into the d-file, aiming to dislodge that pesky knight and open lines for the rooks. Exchanging a bishop for a knight here liberates the d-file for your rooks, promising active play and pressure against Black's potentially exposed king. A bold gambit to seize control of the central files, though it surrenders an essential outpost and invites pressure on the d6 pawn. A subtle yet potent pressure builds on Black's queenside, aiming to exploit the exposed position of that rook. Reclaiming the initiative, the knight endeavors to re-enter the fray from a more advantageous square, aiming to disrupt White's piece activity. The rook emerges aggressively onto the 7th rank, aiming to exploit the open file and potentially threaten weaknesses around Black's king. Shifting the knight to f8 subtly prepares to challenge White's newly established outpost on g6, aiming to dismantle the initiative by creating counterplay on the kingside. The flank pawn advances, seeking to create a foothold for future expansion. Asserting control over the open files with the rook on the 8th rank, the Black player aims to generate counterplay and disrupt White's queenside initiative, a classic maneuver to rebalance forces when facing a pawn storm or positional squeeze. Securing the central pawns is paramount now, preventing Black's rook from gaining any further influence along the newly opened ranks. Proactively seeking to create useful queenside space for potential expansion, this pawn advances, aiming to unbalance the position and perhaps prepare a future b5 push. Activating the king is crucial now, bringing it into the game as a fighting piece rather than a vulnerable target, aiming to support the advancing pawns and contest key squares that have become exposed. The pawn push to e5 immediately challenges white's central knight and opens a diagonal for black's queen's bishop, but it also creates potential weaknesses on the d5 square and the e6 pawn, demanding careful calculation to avoid tactical pitfalls. Preparing to activate the rook on the open file is the immediate goal, aiming to pressure the black kingside and potentially create a passed pawn later. Securing the monarch's immediate perimeter is paramount as the pawn chain advances, creating a slight but noticeable restriction on its mobility should enemy incursions materialize from the kingside. Instigating a pawn advance along the open file aims to break the opponent's rigid defensive structure and open avenues for your rook to penetrate. A strategic repositioning unfolds as the rook slides to the central file, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially exploit the e3 pawn's vulnerability later on, while also preparing for a more active role should the position simplify further. Clearing the d-file decisively here aims to simplify into an endgame where white's rook and pawns can become more active, potentially exploiting the slightly exposed black king and the passed d-pawn should it materialize. The rook's relocation to the back rank now forcefully challenges the long-term control of the critical c-file, hinting at a potential endgame where piece activity will be paramount. This knight repositioning seeks to exploit the open c-file and potentially create new attacking avenues on the queenside by threatening to infiltrate enemy territory. Reclaiming the now open diagonal for the bishop, the knight embarks on a bold venture into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's established pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities amidst the quiet maneuvering. The knight now lands on a dynamic outpost, eyeing the weakened kingside pawns and potentially supporting a future pawn push. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount as the board clears. Bringing the king to a more central and active position prepares for the inevitable endgame struggles. Reclaiming the a-file with this pawn thrust subtly prepares a potential invasion, aiming to restrict black's pieces and gain an outpost for white's knights in the ensuing endgame. The pawns advance to e4, while seemingly aggressive, dramatically weakens the light squares around black's monarch, particularly the d5 square, which white can now eye with increasing pressure.